In the spring of 1886, Clara Vance was a prisoner. She lived in a 5-story brownstone in New York City, surrounded by velvet curtains, imported French furniture, and a silence that felt like a chokehold. She was 27 years old. Her father was a wealthy, tyrannical shipping magnate who treated his family exactly the way he treated his cargo, as property to be managed, insured, and traded for profit. Clara's life was mapped out down to the minute: whom she spoke to, what she read, what she wore, and eventually whom she would marry. A 50-year-old banking associate of her father's who looked at her the way a man looks at a well-bred horse. Clara was suffocating. She possessed a brilliant, fiercely independent mind, but in the gilded cages of the 19th century elite, a woman's intelligence was considered a liability, not an asset. She wanted to breathe. She wanted a life where her hands could touch the earth, where her voice meant something, and where her survival depended on her own grit, not her father's bank accounts. She opened a matrimonial gazette and found a ticket out. It was a brief, utilitarian advertisement from a man named Nathaniel Blackwood. He owned a sprawling cattle operation in the Dakota Territory. He was 38. He required a wife of good health and strong character to manage his homestead. He offered financial security and a house. He did not offer romance. Clara did not want romance. She wanted distance. She packed a single, heavy leather trunk, slipped out of the brownstone before dawn, and boarded a westbound train. She was trading the velvet cage of New York for the wild, open freedom of the frontier. She expected an untamed wilderness. She expected a life of raw, unbridled liberty. She found a kingdom. When Clara stepped off the train at the desolate, wind-battered depot, Nathaniel Blackwood was waiting. He was a towering, imposing man, built like a piece of the landscape itself. He wore a heavy, dark canvas duster that fell past his knees, and his eyes were the color of cold iron. He did not smile. He did not ask about her journey. He looked her up and down, nodded once, and pointed to a heavy buckboard wagon. "Put your trunk in the back. We lose the light in 3 hours, and I do not permit traveling in the dark." It was not a request. It was an absolute command. Clara froze for a fraction of a second. She had expected a rough pioneer, perhaps a bit unpolished, but she had not expected a commanding officer. She tightened her jaw, lifted her heavy trunk herself, and climbed into the wagon. The ride to the Blackwood homestead took 2 days. Clara quickly realized that Nathaniel did not merely live on the land. He dominated it. When they finally crested a ridge and looked down into a massive, sweeping valley, Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was a fortress. The main house was a massive 2-story structure built of thick, dark timber, surrounded by a high, heavy wooden palisade fence. There were bunkhouses, perfectly aligned barns, and a forge. Everything was meticulously, terrifyingly organized. There was no trash in the yard. The ranch hands moved with military precision. Nathaniel pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the main house. He turned to Clara, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "This is my valley," Nathaniel said, his voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of warmth. "I have built this place from nothing. I have fought off Sioux raiding parties, blizzards, and cattle thieves. I did it by establishing order. On this land, my word is the law, the clock, and the gospel. You will manage the house, but you will manage it exactly as I instruct. You will not question my decisions in front of the men. You will not deviate from the schedule. Am I understood?" Clara stared at him. The cold, sickening realization washed over her. She had not escaped. She had simply traded a warden in a silk suit for a king in a canvas coat. A pioneer woman named Susan Shelby McGoffin, who navigated the treacherous social dynamics of the Western trails, wrote a line in her journal that perfectly captured Clara's horror. She wrote, "We women flee the masters of the East, believing the wild prairie will offer us sovereignty. But the prairie is cruel, and it breeds a much harder kind of king. A man who conquers the dirt believes he has the right to conquer everything that stands upon it." Clara looked at the massive timber house. She looked at the high wooden walls. She did not cry. She did not shrink back. She met his gaze, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. "I understand your words, Mr. Blackwood," Clara said, her voice dripping with the refined, absolute ice of the New York elite. "But you should understand mine. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be a subject in your private kingdom. I am your wife. I am a partner. And if you attempt to treat me like one of your hired hands, you will find that I am remarkably poor at taking orders." Nathaniel stared at her. The men in the yard stopped working. No one spoke to Nathaniel Blackwood like that. Not the sheriff, not the cattle buyers, and certainly not a woman. He felt something he had not felt in 15 years. Surprise. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply narrowed his eyes, gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and climbed down from the wagon. The war had begun. The first month on the Blackwood homestead was as a masterclass in silent, psychological warfare. Nathaniel ruled his environment with an obsessive, suffocating grip. He demanded breakfast on the table at exactly 4:30 in the morning. He demanded the ledger books to be updated in a specific color of ink. He locked the gates of the palisade at exactly sundown, and he carried the only iron key on a heavy ring chained to his belt. He believed that chaos was the enemy, and that any deviation from his rules would invite death. 10 years earlier, he had lost his younger brother to a winter storm because the boy had ridden out without permission. Nathaniel had sworn an oath to the frozen ground that he would never lose anything to the chaos of the frontier again. Absolute control was his trauma response. Clara recognized this. She saw the fear hiding beneath the tyranny, but she refused to be a casualty of his past. She did not fight him with tantrums. She fought him with competence. When he demanded the ledger books updated in his specific way, Clara didn't just update them, she audited them. Within a week, she found a massive discrepancy in the grain accounts, proving that the local mill had been overcharging Nathaniel by 20% for 3 years. She placed the corrected ledger on his desk, circled the error in bright red ink, and walked out of the room without a word. When he ordered her to remain inside the palisade walls while he was out on the range, Clara ignored him. She found an unbroken, difficult Mustang in the corral, a horse Nathaniel's men had been afraid to ride. She didn't ask for permission. She spent 3 days in the mud, wearing an old pair of denim trousers she had stolen from the bunkhouse, speaking softly, refusing to back down until the horse let her mount. Nathaniel rode back into the compound one afternoon to find his Eastern, refined wife riding astride a wild Mustang covered in dust, her hair flying in the wind completely outside the gates of his fortress. He rode up to her, his face dark with fury. "I told you to stay inside the walls," Nathaniel barked, his horse dancing nervously. Clara stopped her Mustang. She looked at him, completely unbothered by his anger. "The walls are for your peace of mind, Nathaniel," Clara said calmly. "Not mine." The horse needed to run, and so did I. He stared at her. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand obedience. But he looked at the wild Mustang, completely calm under her steady hands. He looked at the fierce, unbroken light in her eyes. He realized he could lock the gates, but he could never lock her mind. He turned his horse and rode away in silence. The dynamic of the kingdom began to shift. The hired hands, who had initially viewed Clara with suspicion, began to look at her with profound respect. They saw a woman who did not flinch when the king roared. They saw a woman who stood her ground. But Nathaniel's iron grip was a difficult habit to break. He was terrified of letting go. He believed that if he relinquished even an inch of control, the entire homestead would collapse. The frontier, however, does not care about a man's need for control. The frontier is chaos incarnate. The breaking point arrived in late August. It had been a brutally dry summer. The earth was baked to a hard, cracked ceramic. The air was thick, suffocating, and completely still. Nathaniel had moved the main herd of 3,000 cattle into a deep, narrow canyon near the northern edge of the property, where a small river still held some water. It was a calculated risk. The grass was good, but the canyon walls were steep. At 2 in the afternoon, the sky turned a terrifying bruised purple. It wasn't just a thunderstorm. It was a freak, torrential deluge. The clouds opened up, and water fell in solid, blinding sheets. Nathaniel was in the canyon with 5 of his men, trying to move the herd, but the ground was too dry to absorb the water. Within minutes, the small river began to swell. 10 miles upstream, a massive, natural earthen dam that had held a mountain lake for decades suddenly gave way. A wall of water, mud, and ripped-up pine trees, 15 feet high, began tearing down the canyon directly toward the herd. At the main house, Clara stood on the porch, watching the black sky over the northern ridge. She heard a sound that chilled her to the bone. It sounded like a freight train roaring beneath the earth. A single ranch hand, a young boy named Miller, who had been riding the upper ridge, galloped into the compound. His horse was lathered in white foam, its eyes rolling in terror. "Flash flood!" Miller screamed, practically falling out of the saddle. "The dam broke! It's heading straight for the canyon! The boss is trapped down there!" Panic erupted in the yard. The remaining hands ran in circles, grabbing ropes, unsure of what to do. The king was gone. The chain of command was broken. Clara did not panic. She did not wait for a man to give her an order. She ran to the corral, threw a saddle onto the wild Mustang she had broken, and cinched it tight. She grabbed a heavy coil of hemp rope and a Winchester rifle from the porch. "Miller!" Clara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. "Get every man on a horse. Bring every rope we have. We ride for the eastern rim of the canyon, now!" The men didn't hesitate. The tone in her voice was absolute. They mounted up and followed her out into the blinding rain. Clara rode like a demon. The mud flew up, striking her face, her heavy skirts soaked and clinging to her legs. She pushed the Mustang to the absolute limit, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When they reached the eastern rim of the canyon, Clara pulled the horse to a sliding halt. The sight below was a nightmare. The canyon floor was completely submerged under a raging, churning river of brown water. Half the herd was already swept away, the terrifying screams of drowning cattle echoing off the rock walls. Nathaniel and his 5 men were trapped on a narrow, rapidly shrinking shelf of rock about 40 feet below the rim. The water was rising fast, tearing chunks of the rock away. They had lost their horses. They had nowhere to go. Nathaniel was standing at the edge of the water, holding a terrified ranch hand by the collar, trying to keep him from slipping into the current. He was shouting orders, trying to maintain control, but the roar of the flood drowned him out. For the first time in his life, the king of the valley was completely, utterly powerless. Clara dismounted at the edge of the rim. She looked down at the churning death below. She didn't freeze. She turned to Miller. "Tie 3 ropes together," Clara ordered. "Anchor it to the largest pine tree on the ridge. Drop the loop down to them." The men scrambled. They tied the heavy hemp ropes, anchored them to a massive, ancient pine, and threw the coiled end over the cliff. The rope dangled 10 feet above the rock shelf. Nathaniel looked up. Through the blinding rain, he saw her. He saw his refined, Eastern wife standing on the edge of the cliff, covered in mud, commanding his men with absolute terrifying authority. "Jump for it!" Clara screamed down into the canyon, though he couldn't hear her over the water. Nathaniel understood. He grabbed the youngest hand, lifted him by the belt, and threw him upward. The boy caught the rope. Clara and the men on the rim hauled him up with brutal, agonizing effort, pulling him over the lip of the canyon. They dropped the rope again and again. One by one, they pulled the men up. The water was now washing over the rock shelf. It was just Nathaniel left. The rope dropped down. Nathaniel reached for it. Suddenly, a massive, uprooted pine tree, carried by the raging current, slammed into the rock shelf. The stone gave way with a sickening crack. Nathaniel lost his footing. He fell backward, splashing into the freezing, violent current. "Nathaniel!" Clara screamed. He went under. The water was too fast. The debris was too heavy. Clara didn't think. The civilized rules of Boston, the rigid laws of the Homestead, the instinct for self-preservation, all of it vanished. She grabbed the anchored rope, wrapped it twice around her waist, and threw herself off the edge of the cliff. She didn't fall. She slid down the jagged, muddy rock face, tearing the skin off her hands, tearing her dress to shreds. She hit the water with a violent shock. The cold knocked the breath out of her lungs. The current grabbed her, trying to rip her down into the dark, but the rope held taut. She saw a flash of canvas in the churning brown water 10 feet away. Clara lunged. She fought the water with a frantic, primal strength. She reached out and grabbed the thick canvas collar of Nathaniel's duster. He was unconscious. He was sinking. Clara pulled. She screamed in agony as the hemp rope burned into her waist. She hauled his heavy, waterlogged body against her chest. She wrapped her arm around his neck, keeping his head above the water, and looked up at the rim. "Pull!" Clara roared with everything she had left. The men on the rim hauled the rope. The friction was agonizing. They were dragged up the jagged rock face, the mud and stone tearing at their clothes. When they finally cleared the rim, they collapsed onto the soaking wet grass. The rain poured down. Clara lay on her back, gasping for air, her hands bleeding, her body bruised and battered. Beside her, Nathaniel choked, coughed violently, and rolled onto his side, vomiting muddy river water. He gasped for breath, his chest heaving. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. He looked around. He saw the men. He saw the canyon. And then he looked at Clara. She was lying in the mud. The elegant woman who had stepped off the train in a pristine traveling dress was gone. She was covered in blood, dirt, and river water. Her hair was plastered to her face. She looked like a survivor of a war. Nathaniel stared at her. A pioneer historian named Evelyn Cameron once noted the profound shift in the power dynamics of the West. She wrote, A man may build the walls of the fortress and he may demand the obedience of the people within it. But a fortress is just wood and stone until the fire comes. It is in the fire that a man discovers whether he has married a subject or whether he has married a queen. Nathaniel Blackwood looked at the woman who had just defied every rule of self-preservation to drag him out of the grave. He realized, in that freezing, muddy moment, that his obsession with control was a delusion. He couldn't control the river. He couldn't control the frontier. And he absolutely could not control the fierce, magnificent woman lying on the ground next to him. He didn't need a subject. Subjects wait for orders. Subjects die when the king falls. He needed an equal. Nathaniel slowly crawled across the mud. He didn't care that his men were watching. He didn't care about his pride or his authority. He reached Clara. He collapsed beside her, wrapping his massive, shaking arms around her, pulling her soaked, freezing body against his chest. He buried his face in her wet hair. He was shaking violently. "You disobeyed a direct order." Nathaniel rasped, his voice breaking. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the terrified, vulnerable man holding her. She felt the heavy iron key ring pressing against her hip. She reached down, unhooked the iron ring from his belt, and held the heavy keys in her bleeding hand. "I am remarkably poor at taking orders, Nathaniel," Clara whispered, resting her head against his chest. "I told you that on the first day." Nathaniel looked at the keys in her hand, the keys to the gates, the keys to the kingdom. He didn't take them back. He closed his eyes and tightened his arms around her. "I know," Nathaniel whispered. Surprise! The dynamic of the Blackwood homestead changed forever that afternoon. Nathaniel did not suddenly become a soft, permissive man. The frontier still required discipline. The ranch still required order, but it was no longer a dictatorship. It was an alliance. When the cattle buyers came to negotiate, Nathaniel no longer sat at the head of the table alone. Clara sat beside him. He did not issue edicts. They made decisions. He stopped locking the gates of the palisade at sundown because he realized that the greatest protection he had wasn't the wooden walls. It was the woman sleeping in the room next to him. Clara Vance had wanted freedom from the city. She had wanted to escape the suffocating rules of a society that viewed her as property. She had walked directly into the arms of a man who ruled his homestead like a kingdom. But she didn't let the kingdom crush her. She broke the king. She broke him by proving that true freedom is not the absence of rules. True freedom is not running away to an empty cabin in the woods. True freedom is finding someone whose strength matches your own, standing your ground in the dirt, and forcing them to recognize your sovereignty. We live in a world where we demand perfection from our partners. We want them to fit seamlessly into our lives, to follow our schedules, and to never challenge our comfort. We want subjects, but subjects cannot save you when the river floods. A relationship that requires absolute obedience is not a partnership. It is a hostage situation. The most powerful, unbreakable bonds are forged in the collision of two strong wills. They are built when two people realize that they don't need to conquer each other to survive. They just need to stand shoulder to shoulder, hold the line, and share the keys. Because the raw truth is always stronger than the illusion of control. If this story made you reflect on the power dynamics in your own life, I have a question for you. Think deeply about it before you answer. What was the exact moment Nathaniel realized Clara was his equal? Was it when she rode the wild Mustang out of the gates? Or was it the moment she handed him the keys in the mud? Leave a comment down below and share your thoughts. Sometimes the most profound conversations happen right there in the comments. Let's talk about it.